Hello, my name is Mike Trong, and I'm the Executive Director of the Office of Innovative Teaching and Technology at Azusa Pacific University. In this lesson, we will talk about design, which is the second part of the ADDIE model. And in particular, we'll be talking about writing effective learning outcomes and developing a course outline. In Unit 1, we focus on the analysis of the ADDIE program, which is to understand the learners and their needs and to prepare for that in the lesson. In this unit, we'll be turning our attention to the design phase. And the effective design of a course needs to start with clear, measurable learning outcomes. These serve as the frame of a course. Everything in the course, ideally, including the content, assignments, and assessments, will point back to these outcomes. Therefore, it is essential that learning outcomes are written well. So let's get started. Remember that learning outcomes describe what learners should be able to know or do at the conclusion of a lesson or unit, course, or program. When writing learning outcomes, consider the following. Identify the concept you want students to learn. For example, you want them to learn the scientific method. Identify the level of knowledge you want students to attain about that concept. For example, application of the scientific method. Another consideration is identifying the verb that describe the observable behavior you want students to demonstrate. And continuing with our example, apply the scientific method. Identify any additional context or criteria for the learning outcome. For example, apply the scientific method to the explanation of life in outer space. So as you can see, it's a very precise way of stating what students should be able to know or do at the conclusion of a lesson or unit. And finally, identify the level of student you are developing these learning outcomes for. In this example, maybe you are trying to focus on the first year undergrads, or maybe it's for master's students or doctoral students. When you're writing learning outcomes, one of the key considerations is to think about the Bloom's taxonomy. The Bloom's taxonomy essentially is a classification of educational goals. It's intended as a tool for curriculum planning, for delivery, and also for assessment. There are 6 different levels, starting with the lower order skills like remembering, understanding, and then moving to higher order like evaluating and creating. Each level of learning has a corresponding set of actionable verbs aimed at assessing student learning. So let's take a look at some of the action verbs that are part of the Bloom's taxonomy. So at the remember level, which is the lowest, which is about recalling facts and basic concepts, you have verbs like define, duplicate, list, memorize, repeat, or state. When you move up to understand, which is about how to explain ideas or concepts, you have verbs like classify, describe, discuss, explain, identify, locate, recognize, or report. Moving up further, in the apply tier, you have, which is about using information in new situations. So you have verbs like execute, implement, solve, use, demonstrate, interpret, operate, or schedule. And then the next level up would be analyze, which is about drawing conclusions among ideas. So you have verbs like differentiate, organize, relate, compare, contrast, distinguish, examine, and experiment. And then you have evaluate, which is about justifying a position or a decision. So you have verbs then corresponding to evaluate, which include appraise, argue, defend, judge, select, support, value, and critique. And finally, at the highest level, which is about creating, and which is about producing new or original work, and verbs such as design, assemble, construct, conjecture, develop, formulate, author, investigate are all used to describe what that learning outcome entails. So in writing effective learning outcomes, there's a bit of a formula to this. And so you typically start with a verb that, the in the list that I just talked about in the last slide. And then you add to that a noun, which is sort of the concept that you want to your students to know or to understand at the end of the lesson or the unit. And then in some cases, you might want to provide some context or some sort of criteria for where this learning should occur. And so let's kind of look at some of this in more detail. So the verb is the actionable piece of the formula that corresponds to different levels of the Bloom's taxonomy. And the noun refers to the knowledge, the skills, and the abilities that you want students to learn. And then the context indicates where, when, or how the outcome will be applied. I've provided you an example here, which is to identify, which is the verb, the 7 steps of the research process, which is your noun, and then when writing a research paper, which is your context. So if you put that together, identify the 7 steps of the research process when writing a research paper, that is a very clear learning outcomes, and it has all the parts of what you need when you're creating a learning outcome. I want to just give you some more ideas of how to develop these learning outcomes. And so here's a very simple example. So the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. So the story basically goes something like this. It's a very popular American story for kids. And there's this little girl, her name's Goldilocks, and she wanders into the forest, and then she finds a cabin or a house of the bears, and she goes in and she tries, the different beds, and one is too hard and the next one is too soft, and then the third one is just right. And then she does the same with, the porridge that she finds on the table. She eats the first one, it's too hot, the second one it's too cold, and then the third is just right. And she kind of goes through, these different series of things. And so here I'll give you an example of how you can use Bloom's for measuring learning at the different levels. So at the remember level, you can have a learning outcome that simply asks your students to describe where Goldilocks lived. And this would be in the jungle somewhere. She lives in the jungle or in the forest. At the next level up, you might want to ask an understanding learning outcome, which is about summarizing what the Goldilocks story was about. So you would ask your students to essentially, summarize the key points of the story. At the apply level, you might want to ask your students to construct a theory as to why Goldilocks went into the house. And this is where you ask students to take what they know of the story and then to be able to apply something, like in this case, a theory that kind of explains why she went into the house. So maybe an answer could be that she was curious. Maybe another one would be that she was hungry and she was looking for something to eat. At the end, the analyze level, a learning outcome might be to differentiate between how Goldilocks react and how you would react in each story event. So this is where you kind of give your students the opportunity to react to the story and to analyze their reaction. At the evaluate level, you will give students the ability to the opportunity to assess whether or not you think this really happened to Goldilocks. So it's a matter of taking the story narrative and then evaluating whether it's true, whether it's something like that is plausible. And then finally, at the create level is the students would then be asked to compose a song, a skit, a poem, or a rap to convey the Goldilocks story in a new form. And so this is sort of an example of how Bloom's taxonomy could be used at the varying level and in a way that will help students to communicate what you expect them to learn or to understand. Here are some resources that I want to highlight. There are So the first one comes from the University of Arkansas, and it essentially is a website that explains the Bloom's taxonomy and how you can use that to write effective learning objectives. And there's lots of good examples that they provide in that. The second resource here is the Professor's Guide to Using Bloom's Taxonomy. And this is a guide put out by Top Hat, which is an educational in technology company, and they've done a really good job in using blooms and explaining how those can be, the taxonomy can be used to really further learning in the classroom. And then the final resource is from Campus Labs, and it's a YouTube video, and it goes through the process of how to write learning outcomes using Bloom's taxonomy. There are many other resources that we put into the section in this unit, so we encourage you to visit those as well. So we hope that this session has been helpful in providing you some starting points for how to write effective learning outcomes. We'll see you in a next session.